great. Okay. So, right. So let's see. So I'm going to talk about one of my projects which I've been using as part of my PhD research. So before we start, I'd like to ask you to just consider these 3 questions, which are: what did you want to be when you were growing up? What gets you out of bed in the morning? And what would you do if you had a year off? So don't worry, you don't have to answer or tell anyone these the answers, but if you want to put them in the chat or email them to me, or just we can talk about them later on, that'd be really great. But yeah, this is part of a project which is I've been developing as part of my PhD research, which looks towards sort of attitudes towards work, whether that's paid or unpaid, how we value free time, and if a universal basic income could enable us to become more active citizens. So from my experience, from talking to people about basic income for the first time, it can be really difficult, especially if you've approached them unsolicited. You know, describing what basic income is, who would receive it, and how it would be funded can sound bureaucratic and easily become overcomplicated, even though it's quite a simple idea. Also, if any ideological objections are raised, like why should we give free money to people who don't deserve it, or it would just make everyone lazy, it can be really difficult to move beyond this sort of sticking point. And even if you're talking to someone who supports the idea in principle, quite often people will just think that it's utopian, we could never afford it, and so, you know, just sort of disregard the idea as impossible. So in these cases, the outcome of the discussion can quickly become a sort of a win-lose binary, and, you know, all the nuance of the idea or the things around it get lost. And let's see, yeah, so once someone's formed an opinion, it can be really difficult to change their mind, no matter how much evidence you have. So here's an example of evidence from a basic income trial, the one which happened in Finland recently. And so even though it shows really positive results, the information is really difficult to read and process, which makes it ultimately unconvincing. So statistics seem abstract when compared to stories and anecdotes, which can be related to our own lived experiences, which makes them so much more effective. And again, this is where sort of, you know, the idea of art can sort of help bridge that gap and sort of start these narratives. Narratives help us to form our beliefs, which we then pass on to others when discussing a subject. George Marshall, who's a psychologist, says that people hold information in the form of data and figures, but their beliefs about it are held entirely through the form of stories. Now, George Monbiot, who's a journalist, says that even partially or completely fictitious narratives can also strengthen confirmation bias, as they resonate so powerfully with our beliefs and our attempts to disprove them. So, you know, having to defend our beliefs will usually mean that we become even more entrenched, especially when posed in opposition to those who we disagree with. So I guess like the Trump election is a good example of that, you know, by pushing this narrative that it's a false narrative, even though there's lots of evidence disproving that, you know, people just become more and more entrenched. Okay, so I found personally that instead of trying to convince someone that basic income is a good idea, I think it's better to let them make up their own decision. But to do this, we need to be able to relay information about the idea in a way which isn't dogmatic. And again, this is where art can play a role. So as an example, this is a project by a photographer called Jesse Golem called Humans of Basic Income. And Jesse was a participant in the Ontario, Canada basic income trial, which was prematurely cancelled in 2018 when there was a change of government. And Jessie got really frustrated by this because she felt that she had benefited greatly from taking part in the trial. So she sort of gathered together lots of participants from the trial and photographed them and got them to hold up these cards showing sort of their story and their experience of being part of the trial. So, you know, the stuff which doesn't come out in data, like for example in the Finnish trial. So for me, these are far more convincing than graphs and data and statistics. And this is because it presents the lived experience of participants from a trial and puts a face to a story, which is much easier to digest and more emotionally compelling. And also, you know, this kind of stuff like I became a better husband and father and was able to support others. That kind of story doesn't come out in data or in facts and figures and graphs. So as part of my PhD research, I've been using participatory art projects to create spaces that can engage members of the public outside of the political arena and start conversations about basic income, you know, which avoid becoming that kind of win-lose debate. So, you know, I guess like one of the things to say about that is, for a lot of the projects I've been making don't actually use the words basic income. I guess similar to Andy's sort of situation where, you know, it's something which arises through conversation or you can allude to, but you don't actually sort of front load the conversation with that. So this is an example of one of the projects called Between Eating and Sleeping, and it poses the 3 questions which I asked you at the start of the presentation. And these 3 questions are designed to place the reader in the past, the present, and a speculative future. And they're all intentionally open to interpretation, so everyone should be able to answer them, or, you know, form a quick answer to them easily. So this is the exhibition format of the project, which took place in an empty shop on a high street in Gateshead, which is a city just across the water from Newcastle. I deliberately didn't use an art gallery, as I'm aware that art, like politics, can also be a barrier. So members of the public were invited to come into the space and write their responses on post-it notes and stick them up on the wall next to the corresponding questions. The audience was self-selecting, and not everyone would come into the space for the first time they walked past. But I mean, it was the gallery, not the gallery, the sort of the exhibition was on for 2 weeks. And so, you know, yeah, interest developed over the course of the 2 weeks. So people walking past on their way to work or just going to the shops would look through the window and, you know, probably wouldn't come in the first time, but then as they saw sort of the exhibition sort of develop, more and more people came in. And also just, you know, I would quite often just stand outside and talk to people as they walk past. And those are probably where the most interesting conversations usually happened. During the exhibition, I was in the space painting the questions onto the walls. And this is a way of being present in the space. So I could talk to people when they entered, but would be more approachable than if I was stood in the room holding a clipboard and questionnaire. Now, just because I was working in the space, just wearing overalls, people could come in and sort of browse and just sort of think about their responses. And then when they were ready, they could come over to me and have a conversation. And there was also sort of a video and a sort of like a poster publication which had a sort of short text on it which people could read. There's another way of engaging with the project without actually sort of coming into contact with me. Let's see, so over the course of the exhibition, I recorded the amount of time I worked on the paintings, and I used the UK government's minimum wage to sort of calculate the value of my labour or how much the paintings were worth. And so at that time, the minimum wage was £8.21 for over 25s. And because I put in 23 and a half hours, which is equivalent to just under £200. And so again, I could use these figures to start conversations with people around the idea of value. So, you know, I could ask them, you know, would they rather have 23 and a half hours of time or £200? You know, how would they spend either of them? What would be more valuable to them? Let's see. So the project's 3 questions sort of came out of a sort of a general frustration I have when you meet someone for the first time. The first question they inevitably ask you is, what do you do? Meaning, how do you earn money? What's your job? And so from my experience, the least interesting thing about someone is their job title. One of the people I spoke to during the project was a researcher 3 days a week, but the rest of their time they spent being a mother of 2, a drummer in a band, and a grower of prize-winning leeks on their allotment. Now, she said that her job, she did enjoy her job, but it was the activities she did outside of this which gave her life meaning, even though they didn't have any financial reward. You know, and I sort of said, so in effect, that her job funds these other activities. Now, the project's questions were deliberately ambiguous to allow the reader to interpret them in their own way, and this led to unexpected lines of inquiry. So again, you know, if I'd posed sort of the project, starting with basic income, it would have framed the whole conversation around that. But by having these more open-ended questions, we could go down different angles and come about to these sort of different situations. So the aim of the project was to discuss the value of the activity we perform every day and to challenge understandings of work and what's considered valuable work. So I'll just run through some of the responses to the 3 questions. Most people had like an initial gut reaction, or something they thought about several times, because it might have been something like, so for example, what did you want to be when you were growing up? It's kind of what you expected, what people were saying earlier on. Dinosaurs in space came up a lot. But there were more emotive answers, which were slightly worrying at times. So someone said they didn't, what did they say? Not fat. And someone else said they'd rather be someone else. So reactions to what gets you out of bed in the morning were largely pragmatic, like needing the toilet or something to eat. But very few people mentioned work. It was usually other obligations like caring for children or pets, which were a much bigger priority. But the most interesting responses were for the last question. What did you want to be? Not what did you want to be? What would you do if you had a year off? And this is because it required the audience to use their imagination more. And a lot of people ask me, what did I mean by this? Would it be, what was it, a year off what? Would it be paid? Would it be unpaid? And any clarification I gave them usually led to more questions. So, I just invited them to define it themselves. And some people saw it as a release from their daily responsibilities, and so having to spend time with their family, or just not having to work anymore, to sort of imagine what a different future would be like. But not everyone saw it as a positive thing. So there was one person who'd been made redundant, said that they'd already had 3 years off and this felt like a burden instead of an escape. But the key thing about this is that I found that to these questions, the explanations were far more revealing than the initial answers, which is why it was really important that I was present in the space to talk to people and have conversations with them about their responses. And once we'd had a sort of a chat, sometimes it was just a couple of minutes, sometimes it was up to 45 minutes or so, I was able to introduce the idea of basic income and sort of frame this and connect it to, in a way which would sort of relate to their own lived experiences and would resonate with them. Another good thing about this is it allowed us to talk about the subject of basic income without having to come to any clear-cut conclusions, either for or against. So the project's aim wasn't necessarily to convert people to basic income, but sort of give them a sort of a deeper sense or deeper understanding of the idea, and to encourage a sort of debate beyond knee-jerk reactions and ideological objections. It was also an opportunity for me as an advocate to actually learn more about other people's views and wider beliefs and why they oppose basic income or why they thought it was a good idea. It's very easy to get sort of caught up in all the reasons and all the evidence of why it's brilliant, without kind of like thinking about all the other sort of aspects of it, which would which might be concerning or might put people off the idea. Okay, so I'll just round up with what are the advantages of using art projects to communicate ideas like basic income? So in this regard, I found that my open-ended questions led to unexpected answers and an opportunity for both sides to learn from each other. Also, the format encourages people who would not normally take part in a political discussion or an art project for that matter to interact with the idea of basic income. And the project was deliberately playful, which meant that it can tackle serious and sensitive subject matter in a more relaxed and convivial way. Okay, so yeah, I forgot to put those as some of the responses which people gave me, but I think I'll leave it at that. I've got some other examples of things that we can talk about later on, but I think there's probably a more interesting conversation to be had between all of us now. So I'll stop sharing my screen, if I can get the thing to work.